coming! Take cover! Hold the line!
Dawn, February 19, 1945. Sulphur haze over Iwo Jima, the surf thudding like a slow drum against black volcanic sand. Inside reinforced galleries carved beneath the northern slopes, riflemen of the island garrison blinked through periscopes at a shoreline that had glowed all night from the fleet's guns. For an hour after the first waves touched, the beach seemed strangely manageable. Then the island answered at once, mortars, machine guns, and concealed artillery erupting from a labyrinth that stretched for miles underfoot, a fortress of pillboxes, linked by more than 10 miles of concrete-lined tunnels that bombing had barely scarred. The Marines clawed forward behind ordinary M4A3 Shermans, ordinary to the defenders' eyes at least, until night closed over the ash and the fumes of cordite hung in the galleries like a sour veil. Military. With morning, February 20th, the sound changed, a deeper mechanical bellow that echoed through the trenches before the flame itself arrived. 8 Shermans the Americans had landed the previous day, M4A3s rebuilt by Navy Seabees with the Mark I flamethrower, moved up with infantry. Where a 75mm shell might chip at embrasures, these tanks exhaled a single incandescent arc that reached out to roughly 150 yards, a pressure-fed surge of thickened fuel that turned apertures into chimneys and chambers into ovens. Concrete spalled. The breath inside sealed rooms vanished. Men stumbled out with uniforms smoking, convinced the earth itself had ignited. Word traveled along the galleries that the Ronson had come, Zippo Shermans, Marines called them, and assaults paused until one could be brought forward. So decisive was the weapon against the caves the garrison had trusted all year to hold. On Iwo Jima, fire had been used before. Now it had been engineered for the island. Next, we follow these tanks and the Marines who guarded them to see how flame and steel learned to move as one. The jungles of the Pacific were not just terrain, they were fortresses. From 1942 onward, the U.S. Marines learned that every inch of coral, every ridge of volcanic rock, concealed an enemy who fought from beneath the earth itself. On Guadalcanal, men fired into thickets that absorbed bullets like sponges. At Tarawa, machine guns nested inside concrete bunkers with embrasures no wider than a fist cut down entire landing waves. Grenades and rifle fire could silence a position for seconds, but never for good. Moments later, another aperture would open and the fire began again. The Pacific was not a battlefield of movement, but of burrowing, suffocating endurance. The enemy's defenses, dugouts lined with steel beams, cave mouths sealed with stone, were immune to the tools that had won wars in Europe. At first, the Americans turned to the infantry flamethrower. The M1 and later the improved M2 became symbols of brutal necessity, tools that traded range for terror. Their pressurized tanks held only enough thickened fuel for a burst of 10 seconds, sometimes less, and the operators carrying them became prime targets. On Peleliu, entire Marine squads died trying to protect a single flame operator as he crawled toward a bunker spewing lead. When the tank on his back was hit, it did not explode dramatically as films later suggested. It burst inward, sucking the air out of the man's lungs before igniting him. Yet even amid that horror, one truth emerged. Fire worked. Where bullets ricocheted and grenades rolled back down slopes, fire clung and consumed. By 1943, the Marine Corps and the Navy's Bureau of Ships had drawn the same conclusion. What was needed was not bravery but machinery, a way to marry armor and flame into one breathing weapon. On the Hawaiian ranges and at Camp Pendleton, engineers began experimenting with retrofitted tanks. The ungainly M3 Grant and light M5 Stuart became testbeds, their cannons replaced by crude flame projectors fed by jury-rigged pumps. These prototypes had little range, 30 to 40 yards at best, and their fuel systems jammed after a few bursts. But they proved the idea possible. Flame could be delivered through armor safely and repeatedly. Reports from Tarawa and the Marshalls reached Washington, describing bunkers that resisted everything but fire. The search for a reliable, mobile flamethrower tank became a wartime priority. From those early failures would rise the M4A3R3, what Marines would soon call the Ronson, a tank that could burn through fortifications faster than any shell could breach them. It was the culmination of that long, fiery road through the Pacific, a path paved with desperation, innovation, and the grim realization that victory in the jungle would be won not by steel alone, but by fire. Dawn over Schofield Barracks. Late 1944, Hawaii's ridgelines shimmered with heat as engineers pushed scrap Shermans into a new role, and sailors rolled drums of thickened fuel across the tarmac. What began here was less a single invention than a chain of improvisation. Navy Mark I units, Chemical Warfare Service technicians and CB machinists worked side by side to graft flame to armor, testing reach, pressure, and survivability until a practical design emerged. The result most crews would call a flame tank was built on the reliable M4 chassis, but altered inside and out. Main guns removed or modified, large welded tanks and fire pumps installed where stowage once sat, and bottled propellant systems added to push burning fuel in a controllable column. These conversions were coordinated by the CWS and the Naval Construction Battalions. 5 Navy Mark I units arrived in Hawaii in spring 1944 and became central to the trials. Technically, the weapon married chemistry and pressure. Thickened fuel, early forms of what would become napalm, was held under bottled gas or compressed propellant and forced through a projector that could be aimed from inside the turret. Field reports and later technical summaries place effective ranges in the order of 100 to 125 yards for many early installations. Other Ronson-type arrangements and the larger CBH systems reached somewhat farther under ideal conditions. Fuel capacity and plumbing varied by conversion. Many Hawaiian-produced main armament Shermans carried roughly 150 gallons in their primary tanks, while auxiliary hose systems or external drums could extend total fuel carried at the cost of mobility and vulnerability. These variations explain later disagreements about how much a flame Sherman could throw and for how long. Crucially, survivability and control separated the Sherman conversions from the infantry flamethrower. Where an M2 man-carried unit delivered seconds and exposed its operator, the mechanized system allowed gunners to fire short, repeated bursts from within armor, adjust arc and duration, and then move on, turning a single hull into a mobile purge. CBs reinforced hulls and routed volatile plumbing away from ammunition stowage, a design ethic born of hard lessons. Planners stressed redundancy in pumps and shutoff valves because a single failure inside a burning hull could be catastrophic. The combination of a trusted chassis, an extendable reach, and armored protection made the M4 conversions as much a psychological weapon as a tactical one. Pacific defenders, learning of a new tank that breathed fire, frequently abandoned. Positions that had resisted artillery and infantry for months. By later, 1944, the prototypes had moved out of the yards and into Hawaii's training ranges, where crews learned to husband fuel, coordinate flame with infantry, and appreciate the limits of the system. Angle, elevation, and the jagged geometry of caves all mattered. The engineering gamble had paid enough to warrant deployment. The next step would test how these machines performed against the Pacific's hardest defenses, and whether a tank that burned could reshape assault doctrine for the final island campaigns. June 1944, Saipan's beaches burned under the Pacific sun, the air thick with salt and smoke. From the steel-gray surf rose columns of landing craft, their ramps clanging down into a storm of fire. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions had come ashore against one of the most fortified islands in the Marianas, a volcanic labyrinth defended by over 30,000 Japanese troops. Every cave was wired, every ravine converted into a kill zone. Even naval bombardments that had flattened entire ridges seemed to have done little. The defenders simply vanished underground, emerging again through unseen tunnels. For days the battle stalled. The jungle itself seemed alive with machine gun fire. Then from the sand tracks at Charankanoa, the new tanks appeared. They looked like ordinary Shermans until the first burst. The CBH-1 flamethrower, a joint Navy and CB creation, replaced the cannon with a nozzle barely wider than a man's arm. When the crew pressed the trigger, a jet of napalm shot across the ravine like a liquid spear. Pillboxes that had shrugged off direct hits from 75mm shells disintegrated as the flame touched them. Oxygen disappeared, steel doors buckled, and trapped air detonated like explosives. Marines watching from behind cover described entire positions being erased in seconds. The fire didn't just burn, it annihilated. Japanese troops raised to fight to the death stumbled out screaming and blinded, their uniforms aflame. For the first time, Marines saw defenders fleeing from positions they had sworn never to abandon. Word spread quickly across the front. Commanders realized the psychological power of the flame tank was as decisive as its physical destruction. On Tinian, a few weeks later, the tanks rolled again, clearing ravines and sugarcane fields with methodical bursts. Officers noted that enemy fire slackened the moment the tanks appeared. Even diehards preferred death in the open to being roasted underground. The Pacific had witnessed a new kind of warfare, one in which heat, pressure, and terror fused into a single weapon. Ahead lay Iwo Jima, where the Japanese would dig deeper still, knowing that next time, fire itself would come hunting for them. Late 1944, Schofield Barracks and the hastily built workshops on Oahu and Guam hummed with an unfamiliar urgency as CB welders, chemical warfare service technicians, and Navy ordnance crews raced to turn ordinary M4A3 Shermans into something else. Not just armor and cannon, but a rolling furnace. What began as a handful of field experiments had become a production program. Modification centers sprang up where hulls and spare parts were available, and assembly lines ran long into the night, so crews could send finished tanks to the fleet within weeks. The work was industrial and improvisational at once. Welded fuel tanks in the sponsons, high-pressure bottles mounted under decks, reinforced internal bulkheads and new plumbing, routed to a projector in the turret, and it was overseen by the Army Chemical Warfare Service working hand-in-glove with the Naval Construction C. Battalions from these shops came the variant that would define the Pacific program. The POA-CWS H-1 family, often shortened in contemporary reports to POA-CWS-H or simply H-1, which combined greater fuel stowage, improved pumps, and modest armor tweaks to make the system survivable in combat. The H-1 series, later grouped with related H-1A, H-5A refinements, became the workhorse conversion because it offered both reach and redundancy. Dual pumps, shutoffs, and a projector that could be traversed and elevated from inside the turret. Marines and tank crews called them by nicknames, but technical records list them under the POA-CWS designator that tied them directly to the Pacific program. Technical pagework and post-action reports make clear why the H-1 mattered. Many conversions carried roughly 250 to 90 gallons of thickened fuel, enough, depending on burst length, to deliver anything from dozens to a couple of hundred one-second bursts, and were driven by compressed gas at pressures that let a jet reach well beyond short-range infantry throwers, often in the 100–150-yard band under favorable conditions. Those capacities turned a tactical trick into operational doctrine. The tank could stand off, purge a pillbox, and then move on while infantry followed. Production climbed rapidly. CB and CWS records, and later Army summaries, credit the conversion program with producing several hundred flame-equipped Shermans through the war's final year. By spring 1945, enough H-1 type tanks existed that operational planners could assign them in numbers to island assaults, rather than treat them as one-off curiosities. The result was twofold: a supply line that fed invasion task forces, and a tactical expectation among Pacific defenders that flame would be waiting at the breach. The next chapter will follow those newly produced tanks as they left the yards and rowed ashore, first to test their mettle in the Marianas, then to confront the volcanic labyrinth of Iwo Jima dawn. February 19, 1945. Motoyama's ridges wore a hard light, and the salt wind carried the acrid tang of cordite. From a firing slit, a Japanese sentry watched the surf and catalogued landing craft and dark shapes. Officers ordered patience. Men were trained to wait and to unleash fire at the decisive instant. When the beaches swelled and Marines pushed inland, the garrison answered with concentrated ferrages that funneled attackers toward kill zones carved into volcanic stone. As morning turned to afternoon, the American advance bogged against interlocked bunkers and tunnel mouths that swallowed grenades and rifle fire. Assault squads dug in, while ordnance officers sought means to reach sealed chambers. Shermans modified with projector systems moved up with infantry screens. Crews checked pressures and hosed seals and plotted arcs to purge specific embrasures. When a projector opened, it issued a whispered, pressurized hiss, and then a molten ribbon of gelled fuel that struck apertures, seared concrete faces, and streamed into chambers defenders had thought safe. The result was rapid and brutal. Post-action notes and survivor fragments later credited flame tanks with destroying or rendering dozens of positions untenable on that first day ashore. Marines advanced through lanes cleared by fire, often stunned, while Japanese men who crawled out were frequently blinded, burned, or cut down before aid could reach them. For soldiers who prized honorable death, mechanized flame felt like a violation. Their sanctuaries turned to ovens. Commanders ashore recorded that resistance often crumbled where flame tanks worked, and planners began to assign them to the toughest sectors. Casualty tallies for defenders rose even as Marine gains outpaced earlier timetables. Tank infantry coordination sharpened that afternoon. Engineers marked cleared approaches, radio men relayed arcs, and stretcher teams moved up behind the burning hulls. The island would never forget. By evening, Motoyama smelled of burning fuel and hot stone, and the tactics born of that smell would be tested again and again as the campaign pushed deeper into Iwo Jima's volcanic heart. Captured notebooks, post-war interrogations, and testimony smuggled from holding camps give the enemy's view in blunt, immediate language. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, entries recorded men staring through embrasures as something they had trained to resist reduced their sanctuaries to roaring ovens. A survivor tied to the 145th Regiment later wrote that it felt like facing a volcano that moved, and that phrase recurs across several accounts. These were not metaphors but field reports of sensory terror, heat that seared through cloth, a pressure like a closing lid, the metallic stench of singed gear. Where earlier tanks were met with bayonets or satchel charges, crews now found corridors lethal before they could reach the breach. Operationally, the flamethrower produced effects that defeated standard counters. Grenades and satchel charges that once cleared an embrasure either failed to dislodge gelled fuel or detonated amid burning droplets. Smoke and flame pooled in caverns and choked attackers before demolition charges could be set. Close-quarters assault attempts often ended in chaos when flames severed approach lanes or ignited ammunition caches. Marine intelligence summaries noted spontaneous retreats, defenders detonating stored ordnance in confusion, and command breakdowns triggered more by dread of being roasted alive than by direct losses. Beyond the tactical, the accounts reveal a cultural rupture, a military ethos that prized composed suffering and ritualized resistance, found the mechanized oven indecent and demoralizing. Officers worried over soldiers abandoning hardened positions, not out of cowardice but from elemental panic. That panic moved along tunnel networks. One collapsed sector could transmit alarm faster than any radio, and tactical choices increasingly reflected fear as much as calculus. The flamethrower had achieved what engineers hoped for, the erosion of will. This would shape defensive doctrine and harden tactics in the war's final months. On Okinawa, where terrain and troop density amplified opportunities for mechanized flame, this psychological shadow would deepen. April 1, 1945, Okinawa's dawn arrived under a sky thick with carrier smoke and the distant groan of escorting battleships. Reef and shore glittered, while inland the Shuri line stitched limestone ridges into a labyrinth of caves and pillboxes. As American divisions pushed ashore that April, commanders turned over the grimmest tasks to a new kind of armor, tanks fitted to breathe fire. The 713th Tank Battalion, provisionally converted and arriving with 54 Ronson-type Shermans, became the spearhead for mechanized flame on Okinawa, assigned where caves and escarpments defeated steel and shell. Across Shuri and the Maida escarpment, the Zippo tanks operated in deliberate arcs, firing gelled fuel into apertures and chamber mouths until positions would no longer hold. Field records describe the battalions directing astonishing volumes of fuel, over 37,000 gallons, in short periods, and using that sustained flame to purge clusters of emplacements that resisted every previous method. Where infantry and artillery had stalled, the flamethrower Shermans forced defenders into open ground or sealed them inside ovens. Unit histories and after-action reports attribute thousands of neutralized strongpoints to mechanized flame. even as anti-tank mines and concentrated fire exacted a heavy toll from the assaulting armor. The moral landscape shifted alongside the tactical one. Contemporary accounts record Japanese soldiers and many civilians choosing death rather than capture, and wartime reports associate this despair in part with the terror of mechanized flame. American memoirs, unit reports, and later medical studies also note a reverse effect. Crews and infantrymen who watched or employed the tanks sometimes reported persistent distress and unease at what they had seen or forced others to endure. By June, Okinawa had proved the Zippo's dominance and left both sides marked by the brutality of a weapon that turned refuge into a furnace and would force a post-war reckoning and debate. In reefside workshops and corrugated maintenance sheds, the Flamethrower Sherman was assembled, like a mechanical heart within an ordinary tank hull. The conversion centered on the E77 projector, an armored nozzle and feed system grafted into the turret, and on large internal and auxiliary fuel tanks that carried thickened gasoline. Pacific crews used napalm-style mixtures, gasoline made viscous with aluminum soaps and fatty acids that adhered to stone and fabric and burned far longer than untreated fuel. Compressed nitrogen forced the gel through armored hoses at pressures measured in the hundreds of psi. Ignition came at the nozzle from an electric arc, and gunners modulated bursts with foot pedals. The design solved tactical problems while introducing exacting maintenance demands. Pumps required priming and clean filters. Hoses and valves fouled as gear solidified. Seals that held during trials sometimes failed under battle heat. Seabees and ordnance teams added redundancy. Dual pumps, isolation valves and emergency shutoffs, armored cages for pressurants, and routed plumbing that avoided ammunition stowage. Crews carried solvent kits and spare hose sections. Maintenance parties scraped congealed residue from strainers and pressure-tested lines before sorties. A damaged hose or an overheated pump could flash and turn a hull into an oven, so discipline and parts flow were as vital as skill. Operational records and unit logs emphasize that with disciplined servicing and supply, the conversions proved robust. Battalions commonly reported readiness in the 80 to 90% range when spare parts kept pace. That reliability made commanders willing to base assault plans on flame capability rather than treat it as an occasional novelty. The Flamethrower Sherman was therefore an engineering compromise, terrifyingly effective, operationally demanding, and tactically transformative. Next, we will follow how crews and infantry coordinated this machine in assaults, and how tactics steadily evolved under the shadow of moving fire. Spring 1945. From Guam's workshops to Okinawa's forward revetments, the unseen labor of making flame practical began long before the first projectile struck. Chemists and seabees blended thickening agents into gasoline under exacting proportions, then banded unnumbered drums for the fragile journey to the front. Amphibious trucks, DUKWs and LVTs moved barrels up reefs and across jeep tracks to shaded pits where refueling teams worked under blackout discipline. Lifting hoses, seating couplings and routing lines to refuel a Sherman between sorties. The supply chain was brittle and technical, filters clogged with congealed residue, valves stiffened in heat, and ignition circuits demanded bench tests before every run. Crews carried solvent kits, spare hose sections and extra diaphragms, because a single ruptured line or missed clamp could flash a hull. Mechanics practiced rapid swaps and pressure checks. Refueling sometimes happened within earshot of enemy fire, so sandbagged walls, improvised blast shields and shaded revetments became standard to limit flash hazards. Logistic officers kept careful manifests and prioritized the parts that wore fastest, hoses, couplings, pump diaphragms, because readiness depended on spares. Coordination multiplied the complexity. Infantry screened the tanks and marked safe distances with panels, flags, or colored smoke, while simple radio brevity codes and timed windows synchronized bursts with artillery and advancing squads, so fire lanes opened and closed predictably without friendly exposure. Supply columns followed protected corridors and staged reserve drums, so an assault would not exhaust stocks mid-breach. Those realities set hard limits on how many flame tanks could operate together, but where supply and maintenance held, a single flame tank could clear in minutes what a platoon might take hours to storm. As the Pacific campaign pushed closer to the Japanese home islands, planners confronted a larger strategic question. Could this entire, delicate machine of fire be sustained at the scale an invasion of Japan would require? July 1945, on maps spread across planners' tables in Washington and at forward headquarters on Okinawa, the invasion of the Japanese home islands was sketched in grim surgical detail. Operation Downfall, the two-phase plan of Olympic and Coronet, would, planners believed, confront mainland defenses far deeper and more interconnected than any island fight. And the lessons of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were written into every timetable. Far from a boutique conversion program, mechanized flame was being prepared to operate at operational scale. CB and Chemical Warfare Service production had already converted many M4s, and additional orders were placed to equip assault groups for the projected landings. Engineering bureaus sketched larger, purpose-built concepts, dual projector mounts, auxiliary external drums, strengthened pump systems, and revised plumbing to raise fuel capacity and permit sustained, repeated bursts without immediate refueling. Prototype work on successor designs, such as the T-33, showed how a purpose-built mechanized flamethrower might outmatch field conversions in range and endurance. panzerserra.blogspot.com. At the same time, psychological warfare, staff sifted after-action reports and prisoner testimony, and argued that flame produced a uniquely demoralizing effect on both garrison troops and civilian populations, an effect planners hoped to exploit for shock and collapse rather than prolonged attrition. cgsc.contentdm.oclc.org. All of this planning assumed the invasion would go ahead. Then the atomic bombs and Japan's surrender removed downfall from the calendar, averting an assault that in the minds of many planners would have required mechanized flame-applied city block by city block. Even spared the invasion. Commanders and engineers later wrestled with the implications. A weapon proven to save friendly lives by shortening sieges also embodied a moral cost that peacetime debate could not easily digest. Survivors' stories and wartime archives would soon force a public reckoning and inquiry. The next section will examine how veterans, technicians and policymakers confronted that cost in the uneasy months after victory. August 1945, when the guns fell silent, the flame tanks did not vanish from memory. The POA-CWS H-1 family and other Sherman conversions were largely withdrawn as forces demobilized, but their wartime record left a clear imprint. The CB's conversion program and the Chemical Warfare Service had proven that mechanized flame could be manufactured, maintained and integrated into combined arms operations, and those hard lessons shaped post-war armored thinking. The technical legacy moved quickly into new designs. In the 1950s and 1960s, the United States introduced purpose-built flame vehicles, most notably the M67 Zippo family and related, self-propelled flame carriers, which carried the Sherman lineage forward while standardizing turrets, plumbing, ignition, and safety systems. These successors were intended for jungle and tunnel environments and reflected a shift from improvised wartime retrofits to factory production and doctrinal acceptance. The material record preserved the weapon's consequences. Islanders rebuilt over charred bunkers. Museums and military collections preserved fragments of heat-blistered concrete, warped steel, and a small number of surviving flame Shermans, so visitors could see the literal traces of mechanized fire. Veterans' recollections and Japanese testimony combined with scholarly study to make the Sherman more than a technical achievement. It became a focus of moral scrutiny and public memory. Operationally, the Sherman flamethrower shortened sieges and changed assault doctrine, which is why engineers developed successors and planners factored flame into invasion scenarios. Ethically, it posed harder choices. Commanders could argue it saved lives by ending protracted assaults, while critics noted the weapon's brutal effects on combatants and civilians. From its improvised workshops came new machines and a long unresolved debate about necessity, legality, and conscience that would outlast the tanks themselves. The following epilogue will gather those voices, soldiers, engineers, survivors, and scholars, to ask whether restraint, remorse, or regulation could grow from such destructive ingenuity and accountability. Spring 1946. Iwo Jima's black sand had cooled, but the tunnels retained a memory of heat. Visitors moved softly across ridgelines where the island's breath once felt like an oven. The salt wind carried a faint scent of ash and oil that clung to quarry stone. In the galleries below, stairways and embrasures lay half-silted with volcanic dust, and warped metal hung like fossilized language. Former defenders who returned years later ran fingers along scorched concrete and described not only loss but the bewilderment of encountering an enemy that burned with the inevitability of nature. For American veterans, the silence cut differently. Men who had watched pumps and triggers said the memory of flame lingered as a weight, salvation in casualty terms, moral residue in private rooms. Archaeologists and curators pried fragments from collapsed casemates. Museums conserved blistered concrete slabs and a pitted projector head under placards, explaining how logistics, technology, and fear had braided into one instrument. The technical record of pumps, hoses, ranges, and gauges produced clear tactical lessons. But the human record posed questions no manual could answer. What is permitted when survival demands whatever tool works? And how do societies remember methods that saved lives by scarring souls? The caves remain quiet now, their dark mouths reclaimed by grass, and that silence, more than any statistic, asks whether the line between necessity and atrocity can be cleanly drawn ever.